Dave. What's going on with you, man?
Really just another great day, man.
It is. It is so much fun to get together and pick each other's brains and talk about subjects that are near and dear to our heart, but they're also near and dear to our audience. But they don't even know it sometimes until they get information that they've never heard before. That's going to be very useful and helpful for them.
Absolutely. And today, guess what we're going to talk about?
I can't even imagine.
We're going to talk about winter travels.
Oh, you're blowing me away. Winter travels, man. Oh, I can tell you, my experience as being a Wisconsinite and a proud Green Bay Packer fan, I grew up for the first 26 years of my life in some really, really severe winter conditions.
Oh, I bet you did. Yeah, absolutely. I bet you experienced some really bad blizzards.
Absolutely.
Wind
Driving
chill.
literally in 2 feet of snow, and the snowplow hadn't come out yet, and just figuring out how you're going to get from point A to point B. You know, I played in a band, and we had to, come and get to the gig and set up our stuff. And a lot of times there'd be severe snowing during the course of our playing, and we get outside, and we'd have to shovel ourselves out of the parking lot, load up our gear, and then drive through the snow all the way back. And sometimes it was 50 to 75 miles we had to drive to get back home. So I learned a lot. I entered the auto repair industry officially when I was 17 years old. So 50 years ago, I got into the automotive repair industry, and I learned a lot of things about how to take care of your vehicle for the winter because I had to do that for my customers. I didn't own the shop, but I still had to give tips to the customers because the relationship between the customer was different. Everyone waited for their car unless it was, a many-day repair. But a lot of times you'd share tips with the customers and things that I learned while I was going to classes about how you can best take care of your vehicle, and when you're in a winter storm condition or something, how you can best improve your visibility and so on the road and stay safe.
Well, and in Phoenix here, the only thing we have to shovel is that sunshine, and it's hard, man. It's hard.
We love shoveling it up until it gets over 100 degrees.
Yeah, then it's a little brutal. But I mean, really, this time of the year is just phenomenal for us. I mean, the temperature drops down. It's cooler. It's been really the weather's just been great. But what are some of the tips? I was born in North Dakota. We left there when I was 5 years old. And the only thing I remember about North Dakota is the snow was way higher than I was.
Yeah.
We have pictures of my dad digging the front door, a tunnel to the front door, because the front door had so much snowpack against it.
Right.
Literally it was higher than the door was, and he had to get a shovel out and dig it out so he could actually open the front door and walk out the front door.
Yeah, well, it's one thing, we think about snow falling, vertically. We don't think about snow moving horizontally and packing against
like
things.
a blizzard. Oh yeah, it's brutal. And then you got that wind chill, and it's cold, and it's really kind of dangerous, Glenn. That really, when you think about it, people have got themselves into some real trouble. Here in Phoenix, we don't have that problem, but when you go up north, Flagstaff, you go up, farther, you go up to Uber,
Right.
Overguard, Heber, Overguard, Payson. It's cold, right? And there's and the weather can change.
Prescott. I mean, there's a lot of places where people like to winter, at least go for the weekends to their cabins or their away from home homes and enjoy some time. But a lot of times, especially if they're new to the valley and they're traveling, they may not know what the conditions might be like and how they need to prepare their vehicles for that trip.
Oh, and absolutely. And the weather can change at the drop of a hat. It can take a minute. And next thing you know, you got yourself in the middle of a really bad situation. So what are some of the things that people should do before they get on the road and start heading up to those colder areas where they could get themselves into trouble?
Well, there's many things you can do, in terms of mechanical things to as a preventative type of approach. One of them is make sure that you have adequate cooling, that your coolant in your vehicle. Well, why would I need, what do I need coolant for? It's already cold. Well, no, the coolant doesn't just cool your engine, it also protects it from freezing and getting yourself in a condition where you can do incredible damage to your vehicle. If you don't have a 50-50 mixture of antifreeze in your radiator and in the cooling system, that water that's in there, that's mixed, it's a 50-50 mix, 50% water, 50% antifreeze, It can actually freeze, and it can blow up your radiator. It can split your hoses. It can damage your water pump. Even your block can crack if you just put water in your radiator, and you get in a situation where you're below zero. It can actually crack your engine block and destroy your motor.
Right, and you know, when you get like back in North Dakota, when we go back and visit some of our relatives, I learned this as a young kid. I saw there was a electrical plug-in hanging out of the grill, and it basically was a heater for the
Right.
engine to keep the oil and keep it from so the oil could circulate and keep the engine lubricated and.
Yes, the oil will get as thick as molasses. That's
And back in the day, we were putting 2050 in these cars too, so they really needed
oh
it.
yeah, or
Now
straight 30 or straight 40
Yeah,
weight, and then
yeah.
you try to crank the motor over, and there's no lubrication, which is why the motors didn't last for very long, because
Yeah.
people who lived in those colder climates, that oil would become like Caro syrup, and then you're trying to crank the motor and expect it to lubricate the parts. So it doesn't happen until the engine's warm enough to thin that oil out. So now they're using 0 weight 16,
Yeah,
0
it's a
weight
lot
20,
different now, yeah.
520, much thinner oil so that they lubricate more immediately. You couldn't freeze that stuff if you tried, so you're getting immediate lubrication. So again, if you're using heavier weight oils in your vehicle to try to suppress blow by, and you're consuming oil and blowing it out your tailpipe, you're better off doing treatments to reduce that rather than using a thicker oil, because again, if you're going into a cold climate, it will affect the lubrication of your
Well,
your
and all
vehicle's
these
motor.
all these engines right now, they got such a tight tolerances. You really need thinner is better. Back in the day, thicker was better. We put motor honey in the car. We'd have to put it in the microwave just to get it out of the bottle. It was so
Right.
thick, right?
Absolutely.
And so you don't do that anymore just because it doesn't lubricate. The tighter tolerances, the oil isn't getting where it needs to get, so there's friction, and it's
Right.
going to cause more problems. And you know, we talked a little bit about the oil and the cooling system.
Well, the cooling system also is part of the heating system. So I'm going to
Yep.
jump in and just throw that in there. You also have a small radiator in your dash that's called the heater core. So when that heater core either gets partially blocked off, or some of them have a control valve that allow the hot water to flow through, which is in the engine compartment. If that control valve isn't operating correctly, and when you live in a hot climate, you don't test the heater during the course of the summer, right, to make sure it's working. Make sure that valve is working. Some are vacuum controlled, and some have a cable that actually goes out there and opens and closes the valve. So if you don't know whether that system is working right before you take your trip, have it checked out, or at least test it for yourself and make sure that you're going to have heat when you need it. And so that heater core internally, and this is why we emphasize so much, doing maintenance on your vehicle, have your cooling system flushed, because that antifreeze circulating with the water mixture in it, circulating through your cooling system, goes through your radiator, your hoses, your engine block, which picks up particulates as the water and the coolant mixture circulate through those components. They start to wear out some of the metal parts, and that metal accumulates in there. It not only depletes the effectiveness of the antifreeze portion of it, but it also starts getting plugged up in little cracks and crevices. And in those little heater cores and in the radiator, those fins are so thin on there that they start to accumulate that gunk in there, and they'll block it up, and they won't allow the coolant to cool the engine adequately, and they won't allow the hot water to get through into your heater core and heat the vehicle up the way you'd like it to during the winter.
Right, and there again, you brought up a good point too. If it all gets packed up with debris, you got a blower motor that's blowing through that heater core. That's what gets you the heat. And if that thing gets to be plugged up, you're not going to get really good airflow. Cabin air filter is something you want to make sure you check that and get that cleaned out, because you don't want any restrictions on airflow. You want to make sure that you have the best airflow that you possibly can. And then also, if you notice when you first start it up, if you get maybe after driving a little bit even, you get a little steam coming out of the dash,
Right.
or you maybe get a funny smell. Well, you may have a heater core that's leaking. Like Glenn said, the fins in there are so thin. And what happens is they corrode, and all of a sudden they corrode through, and pretty soon you got a little seepage. So when you start to smell that or see that, put your hand down on the passenger side floorboard and see if anything's wet there, just
Right.
to make sure that you don't have a leak. But it's important. We talk about this, Glenn, all the time. Is the most important thing is getting your car in and getting it inspected before you end up getting to that situation. And regular maintenance. If you do regular maintenance by a shop that knows your car from front to back. They can fix everything on your car. That's where you want to go. It's, a lot of people, they get a quick oil change because you don't have time. They run into one of the quick places and have somebody change the oil. Well, that's great once in a while, but you really want to get your car looked over because it just keeps you out of trouble. It keeps you from getting broken down and having a problem.
Right. We have test strips that we use that can check your coolant to see what the level is of the anti-corrosive compositions that are in there to make sure that it's up to snuff, And it doesn't just matter in the winter; it matters all year round because
corrosion's all year.
Corrosion is the enemy of cooling systems, AC systems, and everything else like that. So you want to make sure that they have the equipment and they're consistently looking at that stuff as your car ages.
Absolutely. Another thing, Glenn, batteries. How important is that this time of year? We've talked about this numerous times where batteries hate extreme cold and they hate extreme heat. So when the temperature drops 30, 40 degrees, the battery, if it's weak, you're going to know about it, right?
Right. And one thing that's really important, too, is buying a quality battery. A lot of people look at the prices of batteries right now, and they're upwards of $150 to $200, even at the
$270 for some of these oddball batteries that they put in these cars.
Right, the AGMs.
AGMs, yeah.
Extremely expensive.
Yeah.
So the thing is, the people say, well, God, that's not, oh, look, here's this battery here for $99. I'll just buy that one. A battery's a battery, right? And the answer is
you can't just stick
absolutely
anything in there. You can't stick any, you got to stick the right battery in there. Back in the day, when we had, these cars had so much room in them, you could put a lot of different battery sizes. You could put a bigger battery in there, you put smaller, you could do a lot of different things. But right now, you and I both know the tolerances where the battery sits, there is no room. It's that battery or nothing.
Right. And battery capacity, you put a too small of a battery in a car that needs more energy, you're going to have some electrical problems.
Because everything's run by everything.
Everything's and the batteries these days now have more capacity. A very small battery can have a lot of capacity because of the way it's built internally. But the point is, you don't know that, So the amperage rating on it, they're all 12 volt. For the most part, there may be exceptions to that, but almost all vehicles here in the United States run on a 12 volt system. And so, you say, it's a 12-volt battery, but the amperage rating, the capacity of that battery.
Cold cranking amps, yep.
Cold cranking amps, which delivers the amount of energy that particular vehicle needs to run its AC system, to run the engine, to run the electric fans. There's so many more components. Before you had a mechanical fan. Now you have electric fans. You either have one big one or two small ones on your vehicle. Those are drawing energy from your battery. So to have the right battery with the right capacity, the right cold cranking amps, it's important to get the right one. Don't just pick the cheapest one off the shelf. That's why it's important to go to a professional, get the battery that is specified for your vehicle. And even in the realm of having the same cold cranking amps capacity, there are certain brands of batteries, and I'm not going to mention them on this podcast, that just do not pass the litmus test, if you will, with me, because I know they're not going to last. I'm selling them a cheap battery because the price is cheaper for me to buy, and I can make better margins on it. But the point is to sell the person the right component, charge them the right amount of money for it, and they're going to be satisfied.
Right, and you brought up a good point there too. Sometimes you put these cheaper batteries in the car, what happens is that it corrodes the cables. They sulfate, and what happens is these cables right now, they've got so many leads coming off them that go into a computer. Can you imagine your PC sitting on your desk if you cut the power to that? How well do you think it'd work? It won't work.
Right.
So this is where you can have all kinds of electrical problems, and you could be chasing your tail for a long period of time, and sometimes that corrosion gets up in that cable and you don't even see it. And then once it gets up in that cable, that's when electrical problems start, and then it turns into some serious problems.
Right. And so as a consumer, from the consumer side, I know most people don't open their hoods. They leave that up to the shop that they go to or the dealership or wherever it is that you take your car. But opening up the hood of your car, sometimes you can't even see the battery because it's got a cover over the top of it, especially on your higher end cars. They got these plastic covers everywhere. They got these little plastic rivets you got to pop just to access the battery and be able to see it. But
there's
looking for corrosion on those battery terminals is essential. And there are cleaners that you can get. This is a do-it-yourself thing if you want to, but when a vehicle comes into our shop, every battery gets inspected, and we offer that cleaning service to them there is a cost incurred because we have to disconnect the battery with the stuff that we use. We disconnect the battery cables. We physically clean them.
Right, and there's a right way to do that and the wrong way. You can't go out there, and a lot of people think they just go out there and put a little baking soda and water on top of it and clean it. We take it all apart. We clean it the right way. But moving on here, Glenn. I mean, we talked about batteries and fluids, and one of the most important thing that I see happening with our clients is tires. When they get up there, you got bald tires and you got really low traction because of wet weather, snow, rain. It's not a good situation. That's when you hydroplane and you could end up getting yourself in some serious trouble. And the one thing you want is that tire to make contact with that road where you're up there, especially when the weather is not as good.
Right, and when a lot of people from the valley up here down here snow ski, and they go way up into Flagstaff, and they go over off into northeastern Arizona to go skiing. It's actually required on certain roads to have snow chains on your tires.
And I'm going to tell you, Glenn, I'm going to cut in right there because I want to tell you that if you are going to use snow change, that's great, and you should. In certain areas, it's required, and I get that. Make sure you understand and know how to install them.
Oh my goodness, yes.
I had a client, his son took his truck up north, and he had snow chains. He didn't know how to put them on. Well, what happened was he got him on there. He went and had fun in the snow, messed around, came back down the mountain, and his brake pedal started to fade. He got down the mountain, okay, brought it to the shop. All 4 brake lines on this thing were about ready to snap off. What had happened was he did not secure the chain properly, and every time that tire was going around, it was smacking the
brake lines,
the
or
brake
the brake
lines,
hoses.
the brake lines, yeah. And so what happened was he did damage to the brake lines. And thank God, by the grace of God, he made it down the mountain because he was up in Flagstaff coming down that mountain. You've been up there, I've been up there, and that road coming down is pretty treacherous, and it's steep. So he was very fortunate. So I always tell you, especially if you're kids are gonna go up there, make sure that they know how to install the chains correctly.
Right. And another thing that's important, they're making automobiles lighter and lighter weight-wise. And as your vehicle is lighter than one that maybe the previous one that you had or vehicles you've had in the past, it's important to realize that the lighter your vehicle is, the more susceptible it is to skidding and sliding around the highway, especially when the winds are blowing.
Well, yeah, and especially if you're driving like a van or something like that. I mean, it's it's a billboard.
They catch more wind.
Yeah,
exactly.
catch more wind. But back to, I want to jump back on the tires real quick. The tires, there again, and we've said this numerous times on the podcast, I'm going to say it one more time, is that make sure you get your car inspected. Make sure you get the car up in the rack, you look at those tires, take a really good look at them. But if you're going to do it yourselfer and you want to do it, just make sure you take a good look at the tires all the way around that tire. Make sure that tire's in really good shape. Make sure that there's no knots on it. Make sure that the tread is really good. Check the date code. Make sure that the tire is not over 5 years old. Because if it is, then you really want to start looking at that, especially if you're going to get on the road for a long
tread
drive.
Depth on a tire. Some tires, it's like buying a cheap battery. There's less plates in it. It's not going to last as long. Tread depth, a lot of tires, a good quality tire will have a 10 or 11 millimeter tread depth when it's brand new. The cheaper tires may have 6 or 7, 9.
9, yeah.
And
usually around 9. But
you're starting off on a bad note to start with. So you always want to make sure that you understand the tread depth and the longevity of that tire.
Right, and have the right tire for the situation. Just make sure that and consult with your shop that you go to, and they'll be able to give you that information. Absolutely. Another thing, Glenn, is a lot of the consumers don't even know what's the difference between all-wheel drive and four-wheel drive.
All right, so all-wheel drive vehicles have traction on all 4 wheels all of the time. In fact, I have a Lexus GS350 all-wheel drive, and so those tires have traction all the time. So when you accelerate, all 4 tires are accelerating the vehicle. As we're a regular front-wheel drive vehicle, only the front wheels are accelerating the vehicle. So the all-wheel drive vehicles don't have an option to turn off, 2 of the traction wheels. It's going to be all the time. All 4 wheels are giving traction. So then we jump off to like the four-wheel drive vehicles. Now the four-wheel drive vehicles, as opposed to the all-wheel drive vehicles, they have the capability of driving with, traction on all four wheels, but you can turn it off and on. Some of them it's a manual gear shift that you move, and others it's just a button that
Yeah,
you move.
most of them they're electric now, right? They got little solenoids on them that kick on and off.
Right.
And it's a really good idea to check that before you go to make sure that it does work. Because sometimes what happens is out here, you really don't use the four-wheel drive feature very much. So when you go to use it, it doesn't work. So you want to
Right.
make sure that the solenoids, because they stick and it turns into a little bit of an issue. So you just want, before you go, you just want to make sure that, and ask your service provider. Definitely ask your service provider to check that for you.
Can you test my four-wheel
Yeah.
drive while I'm here? Make sure it's working. I'm going up north on a trip. Simple.
Yeah, so another thing, Glenn, is you were just talking about the four-wheel drive and all-wheel drive, and that's really important when you get into situations like maybe black ice.
Absolutely. Having four wheels giving you traction, and also the advantage you have is that the ABS, traction control on your vehicle engages differently on an all-wheel drive vehicle than it does on a two-wheel drive vehicle. So it helps balance the slippage, if you will, when you're either braking or accelerating to keep the car going straight in line. And it's all done by computer. So to make sure that system, if your ABS light is on, I can guarantee you, if you see a traction control or ABS light in your dash, that system will not work, cannot engage, and will not help you to go straight in the event of a strong stop, skidding, or even acceleration. The ABS will actually control and take traction and horsepower away from the wheel that is skidding or moving.
Right. Well, you want to make sure that you have all four tires have good traction to the road, and it depends on what situation you're in, and it's always important too, look up ADOT and find out what the road conditions are like, so you don't get yourself stuck in a bad situation, and that's one of the most important things that you want to do. Well,
plan your trip.
Yeah, and moving on here, Glenn. One of the things is if you're stuck in the snow and you're sitting there, car running, waiting for help,
or car not running and waiting for help.
Right. Well, and that's important too. You're right, but you want to make sure that your tailpipe is not buried in the snow. You want to make sure that because what will happen is basically you could get fumes in the car, and you don't want to do that.
Right.
So you want to make sure that you're in a good situation there. Also, you brought up a good point. What happens if the car isn't running? Well, that's why you got to have an emergency kit.
Right.
I'm going to tell you, and I know this from Wisconsin. Back in North Dakota, I know that's one of the things that my relatives talk about all the time. They always make sure that they have a blanket in the back, and it's simple, a blanket in the trunk of the car.
Blankets, even boots, to wear out in the snow. If you got to get out and do something with your vehicle, you don't want to be wearing tennis shoes. You want to make sure that you have adequate protection for yourself, because you could freeze, you could get frostbite, depending on where you're going and for how long you're going to be exposed to that. So make sure that you have clothing that is appropriate for
Right. Yeah.
the unexpected or the the unwanted condition that could possibly occur.
That's not a good time for you to wear your thong, Glenn.
No, not a good time.
You know what else too is a phone charger. Last thing you want is a dead
Wait a
phone.
minute. I loaned you my thong. I never got it back.
I burned it, Glenn. That's why I loaned it. I burned it. I burned it. So make sure that you have a phone charger in the car, because the last thing, if you do need help, you want to make sure your phone works.
Right.
Because that could be a long wait for somebody to come along and help you.
And we had also discussed before we started this podcast today about what if you lose cell service and something happens and now you're in an emergency situation. So that would just prolong the amount of time that you may have to spend not being rescued yet. Cell service can go out. I mean, the cell towers could, be obscured by the foul weather, heavy snow or whatever. Or like you said too, if your cell phone goes in a state of discharge, it's not charged up, you're going to lose service because your phone's not working.
Well, and you brought up a really good point, and kind of drove me right into the next thing is make sure that you have a backup.
Did it drive you into a snowbank?
It drive me into a snowbank, right? Head first. Make sure that you have a directions backup directions because
I was going to mention that too.
Right. Well, when you're sitting there and you got your little GPS going and you're going, all of a sudden you lose cell service, and all
And
of
it
a sudden
happens in the mountains especially.
Right. Absolutely. And so make sure you either print it out, or what I do, I print it out and then I forget to bring the paper. So what I do is,
He writes it on his hand. He
Yeah,
takes a felt marker and he goes down his forearm.
Yeah, and I take a picture of it. I put it up on my screen on my computer on my desk, and I take a picture of the route that I'm going, because that way all I have to do is look at the picture, and
Right.
I know what route I need to take. So it's important to make sure that you have that as a backup, because if you do lose cell service, it's going to suck.
Yeah, I mean, we've driven out to California several times from here, and we lose cell service in the mountains. It happens every time.
Right. And one other thing, Glenn, and I think we're going to wrap this thing up. It's been a great show, and is make sure you have gas in your car. We talk about this all the time, and really, you should never run your car below a quarter of a tank. And I tell people half a tank would be great if you could just fill it up. And people say, well, I don't always have all the money. Well, fill the car up and then put in $10, $20, $30, whatever you want, and keep it at the upper level versus the lower level.
Right. It protects your fuel pump, actually, because the fuel pumps get overheated, even if you're not in our excruciating hot climate here, but especially when you are heating up that fuel pump, because that hot fuel, whatever unused fuel, gets returned back into the car in many vehicles, and many of them don't have that option, so the gasoline just gets hotter and hotter because there's no cooling system in the gas tank, and so that fuel pump just continues to get hot. And with the high pressures and the RPMs that those pumps are turning to deliver the kind of gas they do, we have had more fuel pump replacements, I would say, in the last 3 or 4 years than I've ever experienced in the history of my automotive experience.
Right. The fuel that's in the tank insulates the pump and keeps it cooler, and that's what makes it work a lot better. So you want to make sure that, and there again, we mentioned this earlier. If you're stuck somewhere and you need help, and let's say it's really cold outside, and you need to run the heat, well, at least you can run the car. And if you run out of gas, now you're stuck in a really bad situation. So make sure that you keep gas in your car. Keep it. I really am a big believer in keeping it above a half a tank, but if not, at least a quarter of a tank.
Right. I don't necessarily recommend carrying a gas can around in your vehicle,
not at
putting
all.
it in the trunk. That could present a whole nother bunch of issues. So I
And
don't
not to mention
recommend
the
that.
smell, and if it spills, it's going to stink up your car.
Yeah,
It'll be a
fumes
mess.
could leak out of it if it's not sealed right. So I would not recommend doing that. Those are for emergency situations where you have to bring gas to somebody more than storing one in your vehicle.
Well, I hope we gave you some good tips for the winter travel, and I really hope you guys have a great trip, great travels, safe travels, and we'll see you on the next podcast.
See you next time.